What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A rare spot of good news from across the pond.
But let me just give you some reality. In 2003, 2004, I'll give you an even better example. The police department made 91,697 arrests in a city of 600,000 people, roughly.
Yeah,
there were 278 homicides in Baltimore that year. In 2024, the police department made 17,872 arrests. There were only 201 homicides.
Wow.
Right?
That is a really wild stat.
Brandon Scott, Mayor of Baltimore, on the Chris Hayes podcast for MSNBC. Baltimore, Jamie, a place that for a certain generation is synonymous with the HBO crime series The Wire, but a city that has been making some progress.
Yeah, I would like it if you reacted in the same way to the stuff that we said on our podcast. That kind of, wow. That'd be great. Yeah. Wow. I'd get real good
for when you really
feedback.
wow me. Yeah, okay.
Fair enough.
I'll bear that in mind.
That was the mayor, Brandon Scott of Baltimore, just basically talking about the violence prevention that they've done. And he gave some stats there of how many homicide, the level of homicides has gone down. This week, Donald Trump, because he's not ever that far away from any of us, really, he's threatened to deploy troops to Baltimore, escalating a clash with Maryland Governor Wes Moore. He said that we've obviously seen him send troops into DC, and he's threatened to do that in Baltimore. But what's interesting is that actually, well, one, probably Baltimore would argue, or the mayor of Baltimore, Brandon Scott, would argue that he doesn't actually need Trump's help or the troops' help, but actually the kind of efforts and the work of Brandon Scott as mayor and the what they call the group violence reduction strategy, which brings together community groups and charities, and has had a massive success, really.
Give us some examples then of what he's managed to achieve.
If you look at I'll try and do a bit of a potted history. Baltimore had a relatively high violent crime rate. We've obviously seen The Wire, the ins and outs of what the problem was, but it really shot up in the wake of Freddie Gray's death and the protests after Freddie Gray in 2014-2015. What they decided to do was to look at the data when it comes to who the perpetrators of violent crime are, but also who the victims are, and actually offer kind of effective intervention. What that looks like is, as he was saying, is a community-based approach. So violence interruption programs, safe street initiatives, creation of community hubs staffed by local people. To give a specific example, what it means is if the data shows that you're likely to either be a victim or a perpetrator of violent crime, you will have someone come to your door and hand you a letter written by Brandon Scott, basically offering you two options. One would be using the charities and local groups a kind of work program or basically help and intervention help, or they say it's very likely that you'll end up being arrested or the victim of a crime. And the stats show that anyone that has been had this intervention, 95.7% of the people who've accepted support have not been victims or re-victimized, and 97.7% have not recidivated. That's a difficult word to say. I bring it to the table really because I think, one, I didn't actually know this before we came, that actually Baltimore was doing such an amazing job, but it also shows the power of community and treating violence as almost as an illness and a health issue in the same way that we would do with a virus. And one of the things that he brings up in that podcast, which I would really recommend people listen to, is the decline of the third space, and I think it's something that we've talked about on this podcast before, about how youth clubs, sports centres, libraries, community areas have all declined. And actually, that's one of the few ways that you can interact with young people at a time when they're most vulnerable. And we certainly see that in the UK.
Okay, lots to unpick there. Let's just focus, first of all, Harriet, though, I guess, on the reason this is in the news at the moment, which is that Trump wants to send the National Guard into Baltimore, despite all the success that Jamie's just outlined there in reducing crime and homicides. Why does he want to do that? Is he just keen to press on with this policy regardless of whatever, counter information you can put up to say it's not necessary?
Well, Trump's threats, and in the case of Washington, D.C., what he's actually done to deploy National Guard troops to often quite Democratic-led cities, is, he says, it's part of what he calls his crackdown on crime. He's also suggested that he would deploy troops to New York and Chicago as well. But it also appears to be a very direct response to the governor of Maryland, Governor Moore's invitation letter to Trump, in which he invited Trump to come and take a walk in Baltimore and see how well it was doing. He invited the president to see firsthand the success of this community-based group deterrence initiatives that have been so unbelievably successful in bringing down violent crime. And Trump described that invitation as nasty and provocative.
It was provocative, wasn't it? I mean, I don't think it was nasty. It was politely written, but it was provocative. It was saying, don't trash talk me, come and see my city.
If it was provocative, I think that you could argue that Moore had a very good reason to be provocative, given that there was all this rhetoric coming out of Trump that was just disprovable by federal statistics and every possible metric that we have to show the success of all these initiatives in Baltimore. So this is a wider picture of the kind of the use of like military personnel for domestic law enforcement, which many Democrats are describing as an abuse of power, and some Republicans also seem to be quite uncomfortable with as well. But it's a part of a wider picture of this kind of Republican-led trash talking of big American cities, despite the actual evidence to show that violent crime in American cities overall is falling from pandemic highs. This isn't just a story of Baltimore, though Baltimore is a shining example. Violent crime was already massively down in Washington, D.C. too.
I think Trump is also keen generally to be seen as strong on crime because it plays well with his base, regardless of what the stats show or what's on the ground. He has always talked very admiringly of sort of strongman leaders across the world. So I don't think it really matters what's going on in the ground. He wants to be shown that he is strong. He likes the idea that he is creating a sense of security that, it's somewhat up to the people who live in these cities and states, whether they feel that's what he's doing or not. But it did make me think of what's going on in El Salvador, and Trump has expressed an interest in the leader there, Nayib Bukele, who has basically turned El Salvador from being the world's murder capital into a country that is safer than Canada, according to government data. And there's been like a precipitous drop in homicides particularly, but that has come with the cost to kind of due process and human rights and all that sort of thing. But I just bring it up as an example to show that Trump wants to be seen to be strong on crime, and he wants to have that kind of strong man image about him, I suppose.
Yeah, and whatever you think of that heavy-handedness, Jamie, and from a British perspective, whatever you think of Donald Trump, I think if you see images of, heavily armed military patrolling a city when there doesn't appear to be an emergency just to make a political statement, it is quite a scary thing to see. Nonetheless, does it actually, if he follows through with this policy, make things less safe? Undo the work that the mayor of Baltimore's been doing? I mean, theoretically, more security on the streets, that should make things even safer, shouldn't it? What's the problem?
I think that particularly in areas like Baltimore, where there has been a lot of problems with policing, with security, and with people on the ground feeling unsafe. The Freddie Gray protest that I referenced earlier kicked off a massive distrust in the police. We all remember it, of the kind of defund the police motto. And I think what Brandon Scott and the Baltimore his administration in Baltimore has done very well is to actually almost take the policing out of it while he works with the policing. The people on the street and on the ground are these charities and community members and people that maybe have more trust from the people that you're trying to help and engage with. And I think that's really crucial when you think like top down. We put the National Guard in. A lot of that National Guard people maybe aren't from Baltimore or won't know the places that they're patrolling. And unfortunately, if you've got in a difficult situation where people don't trust the security that are there, it can be a tinderbox. And I think Trump in a way almost wants that. Like he wants that feeling of kind of volatile nature, because it proves him right. He can say, he described it as a hellhole the other day. He can say, like, this is, these places, these cities are unlawful, and I can come in and solve it.
Well, also part of the success of the initiatives in Baltimore is attributed to gun control. So they enacted the first federal gun control legislation in 28 years with the support of some Senate Republicans. And instead of listening to what Trump says, I think it's much more instructive to look at what his administration does. So on his first day in office, he closed the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And 3 months later, the DOJ cut the $300 million allocated to community violence intervention grants in half, including a lot in Baltimore. And that was part of almost $1 billion worth of culling of violence reduction grants. So that's funding for like victim services, conflict mediation, social workers, hospital-based programs, targeted deterrence like what they've got in Baltimore. That's all gone. You're in a situation where a president has directly cut funding or closed offices that are dedicated to gun violence reduction and just altogether community-based intervention, and then sending troops, military federal troops, like the National Guard, into cities they don't know, rather than sending them to the border to stop the influx of drugs or guns in the first place, to effectively possibly take credit for Baltimore having the fewest homicides in over 50 years. It strains belief to argue that it's designed to make people feel safer.
Felicity, when it comes to what they've actually achieved in Baltimore, though, are there lessons for other countries around the world, for us here in the UK?
Certainly, when you look at crime in this country, I mean, it's a very mixed picture, certainly. Shoplifting is up, robbery is about the same, homicide is slightly down, fraud is massively up, bike theft, phone theft, that sort of thing. What you are seeing is that lots of young people, more and more young people are getting involved in crime, and younger young people, so more 10 to 14-year-olds are now committing crime. There's obviously knife crime issues, just over 50,000 offences involving a sharp instrument recorded in the year ending March 2024, and that was 4.4% higher than the previous year. I imagine it's a perfect storm, really, of so many factors why young people get swept up into crime. But going back to the third space idea, I think that's really important, because obviously one of the tragedies of the last decade or so has been spending cuts to youth services. So spending by councils in England has dropped by 73% since 2010. That's over £1 billion of money. And that's partly because councils are broke. So there just isn't the money, or they have to divert what money they do have to frontline services, children in immediate danger who need looking after. But that funding that was so important in Baltimore that Trump is now threatening to withdraw is also not there in the UK either. And it just seems to make sense that if kids don't have something to do, as something fulfilling, something rewarding, adults who will believe in them, who will give them the sense that there is a future waiting for them, then it's not hard to see that they would go down a crime route instead. So there is a comparison to be made in that sense, I think.
And do you think that will resonate, Jamie? You wanted to introduce this idea of the third space sort of concept. I mean, is it basically that the political class and journalists and all the rest of it, generally speaking, their kids do have something to do? They can afford to take them on holiday, they have gardens, and they can't really relate to people who literally sit around at home and have nothing to do but hang around on street corners.
Yeah, I think that's quite a fair assessment. I think, as Felicity was saying, the council were left with very little choice in terms of how they were going to use what little money they were given and left with. So investment in community spaces just completely dropped off. I think the other thing, and we've again talked about this on the podcast before, but it is about education and exclusions from school, and the number of missing children that there are since COVID actually is insane. The number of people who have literally just dropped off, the children that have dropped off the registers of schools, and often these are from poorer working class backgrounds, these people, and the education system just doesn't have the facilities or the money or the focus at the moment to look out for these young people. I think it's to me it's so indicative when we talk about, like, you know, the protests in the summer and that have happened in the UK, and of a lot of people who feel disenfranchised, and part of that is because of the lack of funding in local areas that basically are forgotten about by a lot of the media and political classes. You know, we've got a supposedly left of centre government in at the moment that should be funding this stuff, and I believe that they're trying, but they could look at what's happening in Baltimore and see not only does it bring crime down, but it also does engage young people and give them hope.